He called our home a matchbox and my life's work child's play. He told his friends he was the brains and I was just the decoration. Tonight, he's toasting his big future. He doesn't know that future's been foreclosed on. He wants a palace. He just doesn't know I already own the keys, and his name isn't on the guest list. My name is Clara, and I was on my hands and knees. The rag in my hand was soaking up a bloom of dark red wine, obscuring the precise pale grain of the white oak I had spent 6 months sourcing. Evan, my husband, was holding court in the living room, his back to me. He hadn't noticed the spill. He rarely noticed the details. He only saw the audience. This was our monthly Friday night ritual. Evan, who was 34, 2 years my senior, insisted on hosting these gatherings. He was a developer at Ascent Realty, a company that built glass towers that scraped the sky, and he loved cramming his colleagues into what he called our humble townhouse. It was, he'd always say, a performance of his up-from-the-roots narrative. For me, it was just an obligation, a night spent polishing glasses and smiling until my jaw ached. The air was always too warm, thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the sound of men trying to outbrag each other. I heard his laugh cut through the chatter. It wasn't a sound of genuine humor. It was a tool, a piece of acoustic real estate designed to occupy the entire room, to draw all attention back to him. I squeezed the rag, the sticky wine cold between my fingers. I was rising from the floor when Greg, his favorite mortgage broker, clapped him on the back. Greg's voice was slick. "Soon, my man, you'll be hosting this party in a proper ballroom." Evan's answering laugh was a detonation. "God, I hope so," he roared, and the room quieted to listen. I don't know how much longer I can stand the coziness of this matchbox. I froze. I was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, the damp, stained rag still clutched in my fist. A matchbox. He had just called our home the 19th century townhouse I had spent 2 solid years painstakingly restoring. Gable by gable, banister by banister, a matchbox. In front of his friends, the blood drained from my face, a cold counterpoint to the heat rising in the room. He hadn't just insulted the house, he had insulted my entire life's work, dismissing it as casually as he'd spilled the wine. I didn't move. I didn't wipe the last smear of wine from the floor. I stayed in the shadows of the doorway, and I watched. I watched him as an observer, as a historical consultant analyzing a specimen. I noted every boast about a deal that hadn't closed, every casual lie of omission. I cataloged the quick, dismissive glances he threw my way whenever the conversation turned to something domestic my world. When someone complimented the restored crown molding, he'd clap me on the shoulder and say, "She loves her little projects." He made my career sound like a hobby, like something a child does with glue and popsicle sticks. And his friends, Greg especially, they'd smile those tight, patronizing smiles. They saw me exactly as he presented me the quiet, ornamental wife, the decorator of the matchbox. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, long after the last guest had finally gone. The house was blessedly silent, smelling of stale wine and shattered pretenses. Evan was upstairs, already snoring, oblivious. I was stacking the last of the dishwasher when I saw his desk drawer was slightly ajar. He'd been sloppy, in a rush to get back to his party. A sliver of white paper was caught. I tugged it free. It wasn't my intention to snoop. I was just straightening up. But the letterhead was from a bank I didn't recognize. My fingers felt cold as I unfolded it. It wasn't junk mail. It was a final notice, an unsecured business loan. The amount stared back at me, written out in stark, black ink, $50,000. A loan I had never heard of, never approved, never even been told about. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand. The wine stain on the floor seemed to mock me, a dark, permanent reminder. The crack wasn't just in the plaster of this old house. It was in the foundation, and it was threatening to bring the whole thing down. That letter, the $50,000 secret didn't just break the silence of the night, it fractured the entire timeline of our marriage. I found myself tumbling back 7 years to a charity gala I'd been dragged to. He was Evan, the ambitious young associate from Ascent Realty, all sharp angles and a blindingly confident smile. I was the quiet one, the academic, observing the architecture of the old bank building they'd repurposed for the event. He'd said he was drawn to my stillness, my classic look. I'll admit, I was drawn to his energy, his raw, unfiltered ambition. It was a force of nature, something who lived my life among the quiet ghosts of the past, had never encountered so directly. In the beginning, the contrast was electric. His world was loud. He was building empires, as he put it. He spoke in terms of square footage, of glass and steel monoliths that tore down the old to make way for the new. His work was public, featured in glossy trade magazines and obnoxious local news segments. He was a salesman, a performer, a creator of noise. My work was the opposite. I didn't build, I preserved. I didn't tear down, I listened. And Evan, he never understood it. He called it my cute hobby. He'd introduce me at parties like this. Clara fixes old junk. She's sentimental. He'd laugh, as if it were the most adorable, harmless thing a woman could do. Fixing old junk. He said it at the party last night. I remembered, when someone asked what I did. The truth was, I am one of the top 5 historical restoration consultants in the country. I specialize in the structural and material integrity of 19th century architecture. I don't advertise. My clients are not developers. They are heritage trusts, university endowments, and quiet, old money families who want their ancestral homes brought back to life, not gutted. My work is anonymous by design. My name appears on no plaques, but it is whispered in boardrooms I will never enter. And there was the bigger truth, the one he was willfully blind to. He knew I came from a family with some history, but he assumed it was just that history. He didn't know about my grandmother. She wasn't a classic beauty or a society maven. She was a quiet, shrewd woman who, for 50 years, had funneled her alimony from a disastrous early marriage into smart, silent land investments. When she passed, she left me a portfolio so vast it was almost abstract. Evan assumed I was comfortable. He had no idea I was wealthy. He had no frame of reference for the kind of money that doesn't need to be loud. He didn't know that my comfortable trust could buy and sell his entire company, Ascent Realty, 10 times over, and it wouldn't even cause a ripple in my quarterly statements. I remembered, vividly, about a year into our marriage, when he'd sat me down. It was a performance of husbandly concern. He'd kindly offered to look over my finances, to get my little nest egg working harder. He'd patted my hand, his voice laced with that specific brand of condescension he mistook for charm. "Don't worry, baby," he'd said. "We need to plan for our future. I'll take care of us." I had politely declined, telling him my grandmother's trust was managed by a firm she'd used for decades. He'd laughed. He actually laughed, as if I were a child refusing to show him my report card. "All right," he'd said, ruffling my hair. "You keep your secrets. Just know I'm the one out there building the future." Standing in the kitchen with the cold, damning proof of his secret loan in my hand, I finally understood. His ignorance wasn't an accident. It wasn't that he didn't care about my hobby. It was that he couldn't know. He had to believe I was small so he could feel big. He had to see me as the decorator, the sentimental wife who fixed old junk, because if he ever saw me as I truly was, a woman more capable, more powerful, and infinitely wealthier than him, it would shatter the very foundation of his identity. His role as the provider was the only one he knew how to play. The matchbox. He'd called my work, my home, a matchbox. He was wrong. It wasn't a matchbox. It was a tinderbox. And he had just struck the match. My decision, formed in that cold, silent kitchen, was absolute. I would not fix this crack. I would not be patching this up. I was done restoring. It was time to build something entirely new, all by myself. In our city, there is a ghost that sits on the highest hill, looking down on everyone. It's called the Crestwood Estate. It's not just a house. It's a monument to forgotten wealth, a sprawling, decaying Gilded Age mansion that has been locked behind iron gates for as long as anyone can remember. The ivy has consumed the north wing, and the windows are dark, but it holds its ground, a silent king. For the developers in this city, it is a legend. For my husband, it was a sickness. It was his white whale. Evan was obsessed with it. He was a man who built towers of glass and steel, and he saw Crestwood as the ultimate canvas for his ego. At least twice a month, usually after he'd lost a bid or felt slighted by a client, he'd drive us up the winding, weed-choked road. He'd stop the car at the main gate, the wrought iron rusted into a permanent frown. He would just stare up at the silhouette of the house against the sky. One day, "Clara," he'd always say, his voice hushed, almost religious. "When I land the Ascent Tower deal, that is where we will live." He'd tap his finger on the steering wheel, and then his voice would harden. "And the first thing I'll do is tear that old monstrosity down. Level it. We'll build a fortress of glass, something that actually uses the view." Every time he said it, I felt a physical sickness. I am a historian. I live in the bones of old buildings. I knew what Crestwood was. I knew it was designed by a master architect, a contemporary of the greats. I knew the facade was hand-carved limestone, that the grand staircase was built without a single nail. The thought of Evan's bulldozers touching that property was, to me, a form incalculable violence. He saw a tear down. I saw a masterpiece whispering for help. His obsession was his favorite party trick, the ultimate proof of his ambition. He spent ridiculous amounts of time trying to contact the owners. He sent letters, dozens of them, to a post office box that had been inactive for 10 years. He had junior associates at Ascent Realty cold call every law firm in the state, asking about the Crestwood Holding Company. He saw it as the ultimate sales challenge. If he could conquer the unconquerable, he would be a god. After that awful dinner party, the one where my home became a matchbox, his mania for Crestwood escalated. It wasn't just ambition anymore, it was desperation. That $50,000 secret loan was hanging over his head, and I could see him mentally connecting the two. In his mind, acquiring Crestwood was the solution to everything. It was the grand slam that would erase all his smaller, shabbier debts. If he could just land his whale, no one would care about the small loans he'd needed to keep his boat afloat. But here is the fundamental difference between Evan and me. He makes noise. I listen. While Evan was busy performing, blasting the airwaves with his inquiries, I was quietly doing my own work. The preservation community is a small, tightly woven world. We have our own channels, our own gossip. And through those channels, I knew something he didn't. The owner of Crestwood, a 90-year-old recluse named Elspeth Vance, had passed away quietly 2 weeks ago. Evan was desperately trying to find an owner who was already dead. I knew more. I had met Elspeth once, years ago, at a preservation fundraiser my grandmother had dragged me to. She was a formidable woman with eyes that missed nothing. Her will, as I learned from a panicked whisper from a colleague on the National Trust, was a fortress in itself. She had spent the last 30 years of her life watching developers like Evan circle her home. Her last testament was an ironclad, legally binding defense of her property. Crestwood could not, under any circumstances, be sold to a developer. It could not be subdivided. It could not be leveled. It could only be sold, for a nominal sum, to a recognized conservationist or a heritage trust that would commit to a full, faithful, and historically accurate restoration. Evan was polishing his pitch for a glass fortress, a pitch that would have gotten him laughed out of the room and permanently blacklisted. I said nothing. I just watched him. I watched him come home late, smelling of stress and whiskey, complaining that no one knew who the heirs were. Then, last Tuesday, my private line rang, not the house phone, not my cell, the landline in my study, the one only my clients use. The caller was a man named Arthur Thorne. He introduced himself as the executor of the Vance estate. As it turned out, Mr. Thorne had not only been Elspeth's lawyer for 40 years, he had also been a very old, very dear friend of my grandmother. Clara, my dear. His voice was dry, like old paper. I find myself in charge of a rather large, rather demanding property. Its late owner was very specific. She wanted someone who knows how to listen to old houses. Your grandmother always said you were the best listener she knew. Evan was still chasing a ghost. Mr. Thorne was asking me to submit a proposal. Mr. Thorne's office is on the 42nd floor of a building that Evan would have called a decent start. It's an old money building, where the elevator is lined with dark mahogany and the operators still wear white gloves. Mr. Thorne is not the executor of the Vance estate. He is something far more important. He is my lawyer, and he was the executor of my grandmother's. He has managed my trust since I was 21, and he is one of 2 people on earth who knows its full, staggering scope. He is a man of few words, built of sharp angles and starched shirts. He didn't look up when I entered. He was studying a small, framed photograph on his desk, which I knew was of his late wife. Mr. Thorne, I said, and he finally motioned for me to sit. I laid out the situation, the $50,000 loan, the matchbox comment, the obsession with Crestwood, and finally, the call I had received from the executor of the Vance estate. I want to buy it, I said, but he cannot, under any circumstances, know it's me. He cannot know I have the money. He cannot know I am involved. Mr. Thorne steepled his long, thin fingers. He stared at me for a full 30 seconds, his eyes unblinking. Anonymity, in a transaction of this nature, is not just wise, it is a component of the price, he said, his voice a dry rustle. He will find out who the executor is. He will try to make an offer. He will be rejected. He will become loud. I know, I said. So we must be silent. He swiveled in his chair and looked out the window. Your grandmother was fond of shell corporations, a comforting echo of her tactical mind. I will form a new LLC. We will use your maiden name, the Vance Heritage Trust. Vance? I asked. It was a coincidence. It was your grandmother's maiden name, Clara. You've forgotten, he said, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. And it seems fitting, given the property, the Vance Heritage Trust. LLC. It sounds precisely like the sort of dusty, moneyed institution Elspeth Vance would have admired. He did not contact the executor. He summoned him. The next day, the executor, a nervous man in an ill-fitting suit, was in Mr. Thorne's office. I was not present. Mr. Thorne presented my credentials, not my financial statements, but my professional portfolio, my restorations, my publications, my reputation as a preservationist who valued history over profit. And he presented the offer, $18 million in cash, far more than the nominal sum the will had suggested, but it was a price designed to ensure no other bids were even considered. The real key, as Mr. Thorne told me later, was not the money. It was the document I had provided him. For the past 5 years, as a private hobby, I had been building a complete restoration plan for Crestwood. Every detail, from the specific quarry in Italy that the original marble had come from to the correct chemical compounds needed to stabilize the dining room frescoes. It was a 200-page love letter to the house. While Evan was dreaming of bulldozers, I had been drafting blueprints. The executor, upon seeing the plan, apparently wept. The deal was accepted an hour later. The silence of the transaction was its most beautiful part. While Mr. Thorne was quietly transferring $18 million from my trust, Evan was at home, pacing our living room and yelling into his phone. "What do you mean? You don't know," he was shouting at Greg. his mortgage broker. Someone has to be the executor. It's not like it just vanished into thin air. Find them. He slammed the phone down and threw his briefcase onto the sofa, scattering my research on 17th century joinery. You won't believe this, he seethed, pouring himself a large whiskey. Crestwood. It's a complete black box. No one knows who's in charge. It's like the whole damn thing just disappeared. I was sitting at the dining room table, reviewing the final purchase and sale agreement for the Vance Heritage Trust, LLC. I looked up from the document that confirmed my ownership of the $18 million estate, the one he called his white whale. That's so strange, dear, I said, taking a sip of my tea. The sale closed on a Friday. No announcement in the papers, no public filing on the MLS. The Vance Heritage Trust was just another name in the city's registry, a ghost owner for a ghost house. The following Monday, a small, heavy package arrived at Mr. Thorne's office. He brought it to me himself. It was a simple wooden box, dark with age. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single, enormous, black iron key, the original key to the main gate of Crestwood. I took it home. I held it in my hand. It was cold and heavy, a solid piece of history. I walked into my study, the room Evan never entered, and opened the bottom drawer of my antique desk. I placed the box inside, underneath the rolled-up blueprints for the restoration. That night, I opened my laptop and made the first of several calls to my private bank in Switzerland. I began the quiet, methodical process of moving a significant portion of my liquid assets. I was done preserving. I was preparing for demolition. It took less than a week for the rumor to find him. In a city this small, secrets among developers are like blood in the water. He heard it at lunch. He didn't come home that night. He stormed the door, bursting into the foyer, his face a tight, pale mask of fury. "Who?" he yelled, not as a greeting, just as a raw sound. I was in my study, finalizing a report. "Who what?" "Evan," I asked, coming to the doorway. "Who bought it?" he snarled, throwing his briefcase so hard against the wall it left a black scuff on the plaster I had just repaired. "Crestwood. Someone bought it. Today." For the next 48 hours, our home was a command center for his mania. He was a caged animal, pacing from the kitchen to the living room, his cell phone practically fused to his ear. He was shouting at Greg, at his assistants, at rival brokers. "What do you mean, you don't know? How does a property like that sell without you knowing?" I stayed in my study. I could hear his muffled rage through the solid oak door. I would look at the antique wooden box in my desk drawer, the one with the heavy iron key, and then I would go back to my work. On the third day, he got his answer. I heard a sound like a choked sob, then a crash. I ran out to find him standing over his desk, a heavy crystal paperweight shattered on the floor. "Greg," he whispered, his back to me. "Greg just confirmed. It's gone." "What happened?" I asked, feigning concern. He turned, and his eyes were hollow. "A mysterious LLC, the Vance Heritage Trust. Have you ever heard of them? Of course you haven't. No one has. They swooped in, paid in cash. $18 million. Greg said, 'Cash.'" He collapsed onto the sofa. "My whale," he said, rubbing his face. "It's gone. Someone stole my whale." His pride hadn't just been wounded, it had been eviscerated. A man like Evan cannot tolerate being beaten. He can only tolerate being the one who beats. He was silent for 2 days. He drank. He stared at the wall. This was the dangerous part of his cycle, the vacuum before the storm. Then, on the third morning, he came to breakfast with a look I'd never seen before, a terrifying, brittle brightness in his eyes. "I've got it," he said, snapping his fingers. "If I can't have it, I'll destroy it." "Destroy what?" "Crestwood. The new owners. I'll bury them." He leaned forward, his voice a low, excited hiss. "I'm buying the Miller property." I kept my face perfectly neutral, but inside, my heart went cold. I knew the Miller property. Everyone in my field knew it. It was a 20-acre protected parcel of land that bordered the Crestwood estate. It was also, as my own geological surveys had confirmed years ago, a catastrophic money pit. The entire plot was unstable shale, sitting on a 40-degree grade, and it was zoned as a strict nature preserve in 1972. It was, literally, unbuildable. "I'm going to build a tower. Clara," he said, his hands sketching in the air. "A spear of glass and chrome, 70 stories high. It will look down on Crestwood. It will cast a shadow over that entire rotting pile of history. It will make whoever bought it look like a sentimental, stupid fool." He was so blinded by envy, so high on his own desperate spite, that he couldn't see the sheer impossibility of it. He was a shark that needed to keep moving, even if it was straight into the side of a mountain. He didn't want my advice. He wanted my compliance. He waited until Saturday morning, when he thought I'd be relaxed. He brought me coffee, a tactical error. He only brought me coffee when he wanted something big. He laid a sheaf of papers on the kitchen island between us. "So," he began, his voice breezy, "I've got Greg working on the Miller deal, but we need to move fast. I need you to sign these." I looked down. It was a home equity line of credit, a refinance application. He wanted to leverage our home, the matchbox I had poured my soul into, to fund his spiteful fantasy. "What is this?" I asked, though I knew exactly. "It's just to free up some capital," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "We need to show liquidity to get the zoning board to even look at us." "It's just a formality. Sign it." I slid the papers back to him. "No." He blinked. The smile remained, but it was just a shape. What do you mean?" "No. It's a standard play. Clara." "I'm not comfortable," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm not comfortable leveraging our home for a project like this. It seems reckless." The word reckless was the trigger. The smile vanished. His face, which I had once found so handsome, contorted into something ugly. "Reckless," he spat. "You want to talk about reckless. Standing still is reckless. This is the single biggest opportunity of my life, a chance to recover from this Crestwood disaster, and you're calling it reckless." "I'm not signing it, Evan." He slammed his hand on the island, and the coffee cups jumped. "You coward," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper I had never heard before. "You're a coward. You sit in your little house, fiddling with old pieces of wood, too terrified to take a real risk. You don't understand what it takes to build an empire. You're not a partner. You're an obstacle." He was breathing heavily, his eyes blazing with a contempt so pure and undisguised it was almost a relief. This was the first time he had ever been completely honest with me. "You are an anchor, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "and you are dragging me to the bottom. Now, sign the damned papers." I looked at his furious, desperate face. He had no idea he was already at the bottom. He had no idea I was the one who had bought his whale, and he had no idea that I wasn't an anchor. I was the rock he was about to break himself against. My no was a declaration of war. He didn't speak to me for days. The house became a pressurized, silent chamber. Evan became a ghost, slipping in late and leaving before sunrise. He was working late. He'd mutter, his back to me. But I knew the truth. I could smell Greg's brand of cigars on his coat. He wasn't just working, he was conspiring. He was looking for a way around me, the obstacle. He underestimated me. He thought the fight was over. For me, it had just provided the final piece of clarity. I was no longer his wife. I was an investigator. I began my own preparations, moving with the same quiet precision I used when cataloging a historic property. I opened a new, private bank account at a bank he had never heard of, under the name of my LLC. I started liquidating specific non-joint assets, building a war chest, and I made a call, Not to Mr. Thorne, but to a different kind of specialist, a forensic accounting firm, the kind that is brought in when corporations are suspected of cooking their books. I told them I was a silent partner in a business who suspected my active partner of financial mismanagement. It was not a lie. Marriage, I had learned, was the most intimate and dangerous business of all. They were expensive, methodical, and wonderfully discreet. I gave them Evan's name, his company, and the access I legally had as his wife. I asked them to start with the $50,000 unsecured loan I had found. I told them to be thorough. The report arrived 2 weeks later, not in an email, but as a password-protected, encrypted file on a secure server. I opened it in my study, the door locked, the heavy iron key to Crestwood sitting on the desk beside me. I read it once. Then I read it again, my blood turning to ice. The $50,000 loan was just the appetizer. It was the in case of emergency glass he'd broken. The report detailed a pattern of leveraging small loans against future commissions, high-interest credit lines from predatory lenders. He was drowning. He had been drowning for years, all while playing the empire builder at our dinner parties. Then I saw it. The main event. The twist of the knife. My refusal to sign the HELOC application had not been an obstacle. It had been a minor inconvenience. Evan, in his blind, desperate rage to get the Miller property, had simply gone around me. He had found a way. The accountants had found a new, finalized home equity line of credit, filed 3 days after our fight. It was for the maximum amount $250,000. The money had already been drawn, in full, and wired to the holding company that owned the Miller property. And at the bottom of the scanned document was my signature. It was a good forgery. He had practiced. He'd clearly traced it from our mortgage documents. He had captured the loop of the C and the sharp uptick of the A, but it was not mine. He had put my name, my home, my future on the line for his spiteful, doomed project, and he had done it with a stolen version of my own hand. I didn't feel the floor drop out. I didn't collapse or cry. That was the woman he thought I was. Instead, I felt a terrible, cold calm settle over me. This was no longer a betrayal of love. This was not a failing marriage. This was a crime. He had not just insulted me. He had committed multiple felonies. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Thorne. "I need to see you. Now." When I sat in his mahogany-lined office an hour later, I did not cry. I simply slid the printed-out 3-page summary from the accountants across his antique desk. He read it in silence, his face impassive. He read it a second time, and a small, dangerous muscle in his jaw twitched. He finally looked up at me, his eyes cold. "This," he said, tapping the forged signature, "is bank fraud, Clara, a federal offense." He leaned back, his gaze going to the window. His arrogance is truly profound. He must have assumed you would never, ever check. "He assumed I was the decorator," I said, my voice flat. "Indeed." Mr. Thorne turned back to me. "I assume you know what this means for your prenuptial agreement. Tell me." "It means it is a worthless piece of paper. Any clause protecting his assets or, more accurately, his debts is nullified by criminal fraud against his spouse. He has, in legal terms, utterly and completely destroyed himself." He waited. He was a good lawyer. He was waiting for the emotional outburst. I gave him none. "I want you to prepare everything," I said. "Everything. The divorce papers, a petition for an emergency restraining order, citing the financial fraud and asset theft, a civil suit for the full $250,000, plus damages and the original $50. I want it all drawn up. I want it ready to file at a moment's notice." Mr. Thorne nodded, a glint of what looked like admiration in his old eyes. "It will be a pleasure, Clara. I will have the package ready by tomorrow morning." "Good," I said. Standing up, I smoothed my skirt. "And when do you want to file?" he asked. I walked to the door and paused, my hand on the cool brass handle. I thought of Evan, of his arrogance, of his D project. of the public humiliation he'd put me through. "Hold them," I said. "Don't file anything yet. Wait for my signal." He raised an eyebrow. "A signal?" "Yes," I said. "He has one more party to host." He came home on a Thursday night, high on his own supply. It wasn't just whiskey. He was drunk on a victory he thought he'd stolen. He burst through the door, not with the manic, dark energy of the past few weeks, but with a terrifying, feverish euphoria. He was triumphant. He had secured the Miller plot. "We're doing it! Clara, we are doing it!" he shouted, grabbing me by the waist and spinning me around. I was holding a cup of tea. It splashed, scalding my hand. He didn't notice. "The deal is done. The deposit is paid. The Apex project is born." I knew exactly what that deposit was. It was the $250,000 he had stolen from me, from our home. The forensic accountants had already confirmed the transfer. I also suspected, though I could never prove, that a significant chunk of that money had not gone to the sellers, but to a certain city councilman who had been the sole vote against the preserve zoning. "We're having a party," he declared, releasing me and pacing the living room, sketching his glass tower in the air again. "A big one, not like those other cramped little things. This is a celebration. Baby. A real launch." He wanted everyone there, his entire team from Ascent Realty, Greg, his co-conspirator, and, most importantly, a list of potential investors he was now confident he could trap. He wanted an audience for his resurrection. I looked at him, at his beaming, fraudulent face, and I smiled. "Of course, Evan. That's wonderful. You deserve to celebrate." He was visibly relieved. He had expected a fight, another obstacle. Instead, he had his supportive wife. "That's my girl," he said, patting my cheek. "See, baby, what did I tell you? I told you I'd take care of us. You just needed to trust my vision." "You're right," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I should have." For the next week, I was the perfect hostess in training. I was a whirlwind of activity. I called the caterers he loved, the ones who made those ridiculous miniature lobster rolls. I ordered 3 cases of the champagne he used to impress people, the one he couldn't pronounce but knew was expensive. I hired the florist and told them to spare no expense. I put everything on our joint credit card, the one linked to our shared checking account. I ran it up to its absolute limit, a final, beautiful fireworks display of his own credit. I was meticulous. I was planning the wake for his entire life. He was delighted. He'd come home and see the preparations, the flurry of domestic support, and he would preen. "This is it, Clara," he'd say. "This party is going to be the start of the empire." He was right. It was the start of mine, the day of the party. I woke up before dawn. Evan was asleep, snoring, a look of profound, smug peace on his face. I slipped out of bed, dressed, and drove to the bank. Not my private bank, but our joint, local branch. I walked up to the teller I'd known for 10 years. I closed the account. I wired the entire balance, save for a token amount, to my new, private account. I left him exactly $100, enough for the account to remain technically open, but not enough to cover a single one of the checks he'd written, not enough to cover the mortgage payment that was due next week. I went home. Evan was still asleep. I went to my study and took out a single, leather overnight bag. I began to pack. I was methodical. 3 changes of clothes, a simple black dress, 2 pairs of shoes, my toiletries, my passport, my grandmother's pearls, and last, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I took out the antique wooden box. I felt the cold, heavy weight of the iron key inside. I placed the box at the bottom of the bag. I zipped the bag, walked it out to my car in the garage, and placed it in the trunk. I was back in the kitchen, making coffee, by the time he finally woke up. "Big day," he said, stretching his arms over his head. "The biggest," I replied, handing him a mug. I spent the afternoon greeting the caterers, arranging flowers, and getting dressed. I chose a simple, elegant dark blue dress. The kind of dress that says, "I am not the center of attention." the kind of dress that makes you invisible. I was a stage manager, ensuring all the props were in place for his final performance. The house was a tinderbox, filled with the smell of expensive wine and an impending explosion. I was the only one who could hear the ticking. By 9 o'clock, the house was suffocating. It was packed, a sea of bodies pressing into our matchbox, just as he'd wanted. The noise was a physical weight, all of it revolving around him. Evan was on his stage, not a metaphorical one. He was literally standing on one of my restored antique dining chairs, a flute of champagne held high. He was beaming, incandescent with stolen victory. "To the Apex Project," he roared, and the room of sycophants quieted down. "The project that is going to redefine the skyline in this city." There were appreciative murmurs and whoops. "And here's to making whoever bought that rotting pile of garbage at Crestwood look like a complete and utter fool." A wave of laughter rolled through the room. Greg, of course, laughed the loudest, raising his glass in a salute. Evan drank in the attention, his eyes scanning the crowd. He found me. I was standing in the back, near the doorway to my study, intentionally separate. He smiled, a wide, predatory smile. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping just a little, inviting the room into an intimate joke, "a toast. To my beautiful wife, Clara." The room went silent, expectant. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes turn to me. I didn't move. I just watched him. "Thank you, baby," he said, his voice booming with false sincerity. "Thank you for keeping our little matchbox here so pretty, while I was out hunting dragons." The laughter this time was sharper, meaner. Greg and the men from Ascent Realty were howling. They were in on the joke. I was the joke. Evan wasn't done. He was enjoying this too much. He leaned in, as if sharing a secret. "She doesn't get the numbers. God bless her," he said, and the laughter sputtered, ready to reignite. "But she is just so good at, you know." He waved his free hand vaguely. "Making things look nice." He winked. He actually winked at Greg, a shared gesture of male condescension. "She was worried about a loan," he exclaimed, as if it were the most absurd thing in the world. "She just didn't get it. You have to spend money to make money." "But don't you worry your pretty little head, baby." He raised his glass directly to me, across the sea of mocking faces. "You just keep working on your curtains. I'll handle the empire building." It was perfect. It wasn't a subtle dig. It wasn't a private jab. It was a public execution, a complete, undeniable, and meticulously delivered humiliation in front of every person whose opinion he valued. He had just, in one short speech, reduced my entire life, my home, and my intelligence to curtains. I did not blush. The heat I felt was cold, a perfect, clarifying ice. I did not look down. I did not cry. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single flinch. I just stood there, in my simple blue dress, and I looked straight back into his eyes, and I held his gaze. I let him see me see him, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, the triumphant smile on his face faltered. He had expected tears. He had expected me to shrink. He didn't know what to do with the person who was just watching. I didn't respond. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. I just held his gaze for one beat longer, a silent acknowledgement of the declaration he had just made. Then, very slowly, I gave a single, deliberate nod. It was not a nod of agreement. It was a nod of confirmation. Message received, and I turned my back on him. I didn't storm off. I didn't run. I simply turned and walked, at a calm, measured pace, out of the crowded living room and into the relative quiet of the front hall. My exit was a vacuum. I felt the sound of the party get sucked in behind me. The raucous laughter didn't just fade, it hit a wall and died, like a plug being pulled. The sudden, unnatural silence was heavier than the noise had been. I heard Evan's flow, his performance, completely stall. "Clara," he called out, and his voice was no longer triumphant. It was sharp, annoyed. "Where are you going?" "Going to get more wine." He was trying to maintain the joke, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. The silence that followed his question was absolute. No one laughed. No one spoke. I could feel the collective, confused stare of 50 people on my back. I did not turn around. I just stopped in the middle of the hallway, by the stairs. I heard the clink of his glass as he slammed it down on a table. "Excuse me, everyone," he mumbled, his voice tight with rage. A minor, technical difficulty. I heard his heavy, fast footsteps on the oak floor. He was coming for me. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging in, spinning me around to face him. His face, which had been so pale in the living room, was now a dangerous, blotchy red. It was the flush of public shame, quickly morphing into private fury. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low and vibrating. "Are you insane? You are embarrassing me in front of my investors." "After everything I've done..." I didn't struggle. I didn't even wince, though his grip was bruising. I simply looked at his hand on my arm, and then back up to his face. And I pulled my arm free, a single, clean motion that he was not expecting. "No, Evan," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was perfectly calm, perfectly clear. It was the coldest sound in the house. "You just embarrassed yourself." "What?" He was momentarily stunned by my lack of fear. "That was a joke. It was a toast. God, you are so sensitive. You can't even take a simple joke." He was trying to gaslight me, to make this my fault, to shrink me back down to the sentimental wife he could control. But the woman he was talking to was gone. She had packed a bag and was waiting in the car. "A joke," I repeated, tasting the word. "I see." I tilted my head, as if considering this. "So, I'm just trying to understand the parameters of your humor. Evan, tell me, was it a joke when you forged my signature on a $250,000 loan application?" He froze. It was not a gradual change. It was instantaneous. It was as if a switch had been thrown, cutting power to his entire body. All the color, all the rage, all the blood drained from his face, leaving behind a clammy gray-white mask. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked, for the first time since I had met him, truly and completely speechless. He had been a man of pure, forward-blasting noise, and I had just found his off switch. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a new, dawning terror. It was no longer about his party. It was no longer about his joke. It was about the words I had just said. I looked past him to the living room, where I could see the confused, silent faces of his colleagues, his empire, all peering out into the hallway, sensing the blood in the water. I turned my gaze back to my husband. "Your party's not over," I said, my voice still quiet, still devoid of any emotion. "Your audience is waiting for you. Do you want to go back in and tell them the rest of the story?" He sputtered, his hands flapping uselessly at his sides. You don't know what you're talking about. You're drunk." "I know." I stepped past him, out of the hallway and back into the full light of the living room. The silence was absolute. Every guest was frozen, a tableau of shocked faces, all turned toward me. I raised my voice, making it clear and carrying it to the back wall. "Evan's right. Everyone. He was just saying I don't understand the numbers." I turned my head to Greg, who looked like he was about to be physically ill. "He's absolutely correct. I didn't. I had to hire a forensic accountant to understand them." The air became thinner. I saw one of the potential investors, a man I knew Evan had been chasing for months, fold his arms. "And I learned so much," I continued. Walking slowly toward the center of the room, I felt like I was walking on a stage I had just built. For example, I learned that his apex project, the one he just toasted, was funded entirely with an illegal second mortgage, one that was secured by forging my signature. There was a collective, audible gasp. Greg took a visible step back, distancing himself, as if I had thrown a snake into the room. "Evan," the investor snapped, his voice sharp. Evan finally found his voice. It was not a whisper, it was a roar of desperation. "She's lying. She's lost her mind. This is sabotage. She's trying to sabotage me because I'm finally succeeding." "Sabotage you?" I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "You did that all by yourself. Evan, you did it when you bet our home, my home, on a piece of land that is geologically unstable and zoned as a permanent nature preserve. It's unbuildable. It's a worthless hole in the ground." I let that sink in. "Oh, and just as a final data point," I added, looking at the stunned faces of his colleagues. "Our joint account, the one that's supposed to pay for this party, and the mortgage on this house next week, it currently contains $100. Good luck with the payments." He just stared at me, his mind clearly unable to process all the information. He shook his head, latching on to the one thing he could. "But, Crestwood," he stammered, his voice pathetic. I had to beat Crestwood." "Ah, yes, Crestwood." I stopped, my back to the cold fireplace. I looked at him, the man I had once loved, now just a hollow, crumbling facade. "You're right. I didn't understand your vision. I was too busy with my hobby." I reached into the pocket of my simple blue dress. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy iron. I pulled out the key. I didn't hand it to him. I threw it. I threw it onto the glass coffee table in front of him. It landed with a sound like a hammer hitting stone, a deep, resonant clank that echoed in the dead silence of the room. Evan's eyes dropped to the key. He recognized it. I could see the moment his brain registered the antique shape, the unmistakable, rusted crest of the Vance family. "The owners of Crestwood," I said, my voice as cold and flat as the key. "They didn't want their home demolished by a man like you. They wanted a preservationist. They wanted someone who would listen to the house." I let the silence hang, then delivered the final line. "So they sold it to me, 6 weeks ago." I watched his face as he put it together. The Vance Heritage Trust. My maiden name, his white whale, in my pocket. "You said you were going to build a tower to look down on it," I said, picking up my small, simple purse from a side chair. "The only problem is, Evan, where are you going to be standing when you do? Because as soon as the bank processes your multiple felonies, they will be foreclosing on this house. The one you had the nerve to call a matchbox." He didn't move. He was a statue, a monument to his own arrogance. "Enjoy your party," I said to his frozen form. "Thank you for making everything so perfectly clear." "Oh," I added, pausing at the door. "My lawyer, Mr. Thorne, will be serving you the divorce papers on Monday morning. He'll meet you at your office, or wherever it is you'll be staying after the bank changes the locks." I turned, opened the front door, and walked out into the cool, clear night, leaving Evan to stand alone in the wreckage of his empire, surrounded by the total damning silence of the friends who had, just moments before, been laughing with him.